Good evening and welcome to the space. We're going to get started in just about another minute as people begin to enter the Zoom and join us on Facebook. Thank you everyone for coming together tonight as we talk about a very important issue affecting us nationally and globally. I am the Reverend Katie Romano Griffin, one of the ministers serving the Cedar Lane community. I want to thank all of you who've entered this space on mute, and I invite everyone to please turn their videos off unless you are one of the panelists. This will help you to be able to be more present to our panelists as they're speaking. And we have an amazing group of panelists that are with us tonight. Their full bios are going to be linked in the chat via a PDF, and we're also going to show you some slides after we have a question and answer period with additional contact information. I hope that you will read the PDF, take photos of the slides, and consider supporting these organizations represented here with your time, with your talents, and with your treasure. Let me give you some brief introductions of the powerful women who will be speaking tonight. Casey Carter Swegman is a nationally recognized expert on the issues of forced and child marriage in the United States. Casey works with Tahirih as the Forced Marriage Initiative Project Manager and oversees direct service to survivors across the country and provides technical assistance nationally to service providers and advocates. As co-founder and executive director of the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking, LCHT, Amanda Finger has worked on anti-trafficking in Colorado since 2005. She has an incredible background of service that spans from Maryland and DC to Colorado. She was appointed in 2014 to the governor's Colorado Human Trafficking Council, co-chairing the Data and Research Task Force. Martina E Vandenberg is the founder and president of the Human Trafficking Legal Center, HT Legal. Vandenberg established the organization in 2012 with generous support from the Open Society Foundation's fellowship program and has spent 2 decades fighting human trafficking, forced labor, rape as a war crime, and violence against women. Finest Lopanga has been an active member of the National Survivor Network since 2013. As a survivor of labor trafficking, she uses her voice and experience to educate the community and raise awareness. Her mission is to prevent other survivors from being re-victimized and to give them hope and courage to heal, become leaders, and achieve their dreams. Ms. Lopanga has testified before the U.S. Congress regarding the challenges survivors face. She's presented to the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, has provided training for pro bono lawyers, law students, physicians, law enforcement officials, and federal prosecutors. She's spoken at national conferences and developed expert training materials. Ms. Lopanga serves as a survivor consultant to the Human Trafficking Legal Center in Washington, D.C. Ms. Lopanga is the recipient of the Justice for Victims of Crime Award from the U.S. Attorney's Office of Washington, D.C. She believes survivor voices and leadership are essential to advocacy on human trafficking. She's a certified nursing assistant and continues to pursue her goal of becoming a registered nurse. I want to thank all of the panelists for being here today and for the amazing work that you do. And I also want to thank Lori Stone and Nicole Kazi for coordinating this entire forum. I want to thank Barbara Thompson, who's helping out with AV today, and Betsy Banks, our pastoral visitors coordinator, who is also going to be active in the chat. Human trafficking is an egregious human rights violation that impacts people of all genders, adults, young adults, and children across the globe. Here in the United States, non-governmental organizations provide support to the survivors of both sex and labor trafficking. Traffickers prey on victims, both US citizens and non-citizens, who are vulnerable to abuse. In recent years, we've seen human trafficking cases targeting people with intellectual disabilities, LGBTQIA, youth, children in the foster care system, people trapped in homelessness, and members of historically marginalized communities. Sadly, media reports often focus on the most sensational cases. QAnon has weaponized human trafficking, exploiting it as conspiracy theory fodder. Today's panel includes leading experts on human trafficking who will share with you a more accurate picture of human trafficking in the United States. We hope that you leave today's panel with an understanding of human trafficking, what can be done to prevent it, what can be done to support survivors, and how you can get involved. We'd like to begin our evening tonight with a leader in the anti-trafficking movement, an expert with lived experience. Finus Lepenga often says, nothing about us without us. I'd like to formally invite Finus Lepenga to please share your story.
Thank you. What a beautiful introduction. And thank you for highlighting the topic, this afternoon. Good afternoon again. My name is Finus Lepenga. As it's highlighted again, like when you heard about human trafficking, most of the time, majority of time, their mindset, people just think about sex trafficking, child exploitation, but forget about labor trafficking. So I was a victim of human trafficking to the United States by a diplomat. I was trafficked in Silver Spring, Maryland for 3 years. I was trapped in my trafficker's home. I had to cook, clean, ironing every single clothes, landscaping. I also worked in a family industrial carpet business, doing carpet cleaning. I worked long hours, more than 14 hours a day. I was forced to sleep in the basement. I wasn't allowed to use the soap or lotion. I was told I was make the family contaminated. I was paid 0 to less than 40 cents an hour. I suffered physically, emotionally, and mentally. The whole time my trafficker was threatening me that when I ran away, she reported me to authorities because she was a diplomat. I'll get in trouble. I could not speak English. I didn't know what to do. I was invisible. Silver Spring, Maryland, Montgomery County, a beautiful neighborhood. Cars was driving up and down, but nobody ever looked in my eye. I know when we walk, when we are talking, you can see when somebody's having a bad day just looking by their faces, but nobody look in my faces. People are coming to the house, but they never say anything. I was scared. One day I reached out to church, thought they're gonna help me. But that church didn't help me either. I continued to suffer in that place. I had no medical condition. Health care. I was getting sick. I never get medical, including like dental. Dental is crucial to everyone. So for me, not having even to able to access simple, essential care like toothpaste, toothbrush, my teeth became bad. One day, I couldn't take it anymore. I wanted to die. I ran away because I didn't want to die in that house. Because I knew that when I die in that house, my trafficker didn't care about me. If they couldn't offer me food, what about my life? They would just dump me in the dumpster. I ran away. I became homeless. I was homeless. My trafficker found me. So human trafficking is a big issue. It's happened to so many people. I'm lucky I made it out alive. Unfortunately, I'm just one of so many. I remember 2 years ago, I read an article was written by Atlantic. There was a story about a woman. Her name is Lola. Lola's story was similar like mine. She was a domestic worker. Unfortunately, Lola did not make it out. What makes me angry, that was a long time ago, and she was trafficked for 62 years, and I was trafficked for 3 years later. But I'm not the only one. But what makes me angry, because Lola was passed from generation to generation, and the community failed Lola. Her family have no closure. Lola have never find her voice. But today, when I speak, I don't speak up for myself. I speak for those who are coming behind me. By the way, 2019, I testified in my own state of Maryland. There was no labor statute. It was like a punch in the face when I hear there was no labor statute in Maryland. So I stood up. I testified in the District of Annapolis, Maryland, to help to pass the bill, labor statute. Now, Maryland have a labor bill. Labor is a crime. But I didn't stop there. I stand up, I use my voice louder. I took my trafficker to court because I didn't understand. I didn't know what the immunity is. But because it's the way that my trafficker used a lot, threatened me, so she can continue to use me to control me, to benefit, to benefit out of my life. I know I couldn't speak English, but guess what? I'm a fighter. When you hear about resilient, I am resilient, because after I escaped when I was a homeless, I taught myself English through watching cartoon. And I continued to stand up. I took my trafficker to court. And guess what? I won. I break the immunity. So I wanna tell the people out there, victims, that there is help. But not only that, I wanted to educate the community, because I don't want what happened to me to happen to another person. 3 years is a lot. I'm just fortunate that I made it out. As I said, there's so many people are still there waiting for help. When you are trapped, you don't have no means. Like me, I had no cell phone. So it's that kind of a situation. Sometimes it takes like somebody to see you, to say something. So it takes a village, and that village is including you and I. You can just be a hero. And I want you today, from today, if you are not doing something yet, I want you to educate yourself. join this community. Be a hero to somebody. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here and for sharing your story and for the incredible, powerful work that you're continuing to do in the community. I'd like to invite Amanda to please share a bit of an overview for us today.
Wow, thank you. Thank you to Finesse for sharing your important words, your perspectives, and your truth. That was truly powerful. I think you also set an important tone for how we come to understand human trafficking, that this is real, this is happening everywhere, and maybe it doesn't look like what we have heard and seen mostly in the media. I want to thank you, Reverend Katie, and I want to thank my dear friend Laurie Stone for bringing this human rights issue into focus at the top of the year, as January is Human Trafficking Awareness Month. Today, we're talking about sensitive topics, some things that can be political or controversial or also triggering. And to that point, I want to specifically call out that misinformation can be harmful to issues we care about, and it's no different for human trafficking. What I've seen in my 16 years working in this field is not jiving with many of the messages being promoted online via groups like QAnon, as Reverend Katie mentioned in her intro. And this would be the panel to ask about any of those questions or concerns that have been raised for you. So, human trafficking was formally defined in 2000 in this country. That's only 2 decades ago. Talking about human trafficking as a human rights abuse is to talk first about the person, not about their legal status, nor about how they choose to labor. For example, not all sex work is human trafficking. Not all smuggling across a border is human trafficking. If an individual is unable to leave a situation because a perpetrator is using force, fraud, or coercion, exerting that level of control over someone, that is illegal. To put that a little differently, human trafficking is a severe form of exploitation for labor, including sex, through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. These 3 words are very important to this definition. If force, fraud, or coercion is not there, you may be seeing some other type of abuse or exploitation. In the US, we parse out our definition of human trafficking into 3 general categories. First, those under 18 involved in commercial sex acts. Second, those over 18 involved in commercial sex acts through force, fraud, or coercion. And third, those forced to perform labor and or services in conditions of involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery through force, fraud, or coercion. You'll notice that the words force, fraud, or coercion are not present in that first category. And that's because as a society, we determined that those under the age of 18 do not have the cognitive ability to consent to commercial sex. And that's an important distinction and negates the sort of outdated labeling of child prostitute or teen prostitute. Additionally, commercial sex means anything of value that's exchanged for sex acts. So it doesn't have to be money, could be housing, food, protection, drugs, anything of value. Like Reverend Katie introduced, all genders, children and adults, US citizens and foreign nationals have all experienced this form of exploitation here in the United States. We've seen this severe exploitation occur in many different industries here in the US and around the world with different tactics used. In the US, non-transferable visas, withholding of documents, force and threats to family members of both documented and undocumented workers in the agricultural sector, on ranches and farms, as sheep herders, in the construction, hospitality, tourism industries. Globally, we're understanding more about forced labor in the fishing industry to meet the global rise in seafood demand. We have also long paid attention to the garment industry for its dangerous working conditions, abusive practices, and overseas supply chains. And my fellow panelists, Martina and Casey, can give many more examples to this. I've been asked to talk a bit about research or the scope of this problem. To understand how far and wide this problem reaches, it's complicated. And first, I want to caution you on human trafficking data. Human trafficking victims are considered a hidden population. Most do not identify as a victim in the first place, and therefore may not seek services. Many vulnerable populations fear law enforcement for many reasons, and therefore do not report. This could be because they or a family member are undocumented, because they've been forced to commit crimes as a result of their trafficking, and they're afraid of being arrested, potentially because they've been told by their trafficker that they will be arrested if they try to report. Or many have suffered abuses in systems before. So they've suffered abuse while in the child welfare system or when incarcerated and do not trust law enforcement to protect them. During the pandemic, people detained in our immigration system have noted their fear of contracting COVID while imprisoned and choose to be deported rather than waiting up to the 2 years that it has been taking for a T visa to be issued in their experience around trafficking. So how can we count and truly measure this problem if people experiencing this crime do not feel that they will be believed, or that it takes so long for our systems to investigate one's crime? So while it's extremely difficult to measure the prevalence of human trafficking, there are efforts underway to attempt it. Currently, a few 100,000 people are estimated to be in forced labor in the US and around 40 million worldwide. While our efforts defined human trafficking as a federal crime, our communities have long seen this exploitation, but simply may have called it something else, like child abuse, forced migration, forced prostitution. We are getting better at setting up more systematic ways of measuring the problem, but cities and states have a long way to go until we have a more robust picture. My organization, while based in Denver, is interested in the ways in which human trafficking manifests in communities and the resources needed to respond. In Colorado, we've identified victims from 42 countries, including from the US. About 60% of identified survivors in Colorado are foreign nationals and 40% are from the US. From prevention and protection perspectives, that means we need to establish resources accessible in many different languages and dialects, train several different responders in governmental and non-governmental sectors, coordinate efforts to prevent and serve survivors. It also means we need to prioritize opportunities for survivors to lead and inform these efforts and to learn from their expertise. And just to wrap up my section, we have learned a great deal about human trafficking and forced labor in the past 2 decades, but we have more listening and more work ahead, and I appreciate your willingness to learn more through forums like these.
Thank you so much, Amanda. That was an incredible amount of information, and it was really, you shared it in a way that I know is certainly helping me to remember everything that you said. You made all of the information really approachable and understandable, and I so thank you for doing the work that you're doing. And to add another dimension to what we've been talking about this evening, Casey is going to be sharing some of her work with us.
Was it me next or Martina next? I seem to recall Martina was before me.
You can go. It's okay.
Okay. Well, thank you, Reverend Griffin, and thank you so much to Finus and to Amanda. It is really such a privilege to be on this panel with you all today. And from my perspective, as someone sort of focused on a bit of a niche issue within this broader movement, I think the best way to really illustrate the way in which forced marriage can intersect and at times be used to facilitate human trafficking here in the United States would be to share a case story with you all. And so again, as Amanda stated, this could be a moment where some things, some details might be triggering or bring some emotions to the surface for some folks in the audience. And so if at any time you need to mute me or step away, please feel free to do so. But just want to share the story of a survivor that I had the opportunity to work with a few years ago. And this particular young woman had been brought from out of state to Maryland, when she was just 16 years old. Her mother drove her across state lines, and with just her mother's signature to represent parental consent, the county clerk signed off on my client's marriage to a man she had never met and a man who was twice her age, with no questions asked. My client's mother, who she describes as being perceived in the community as everyone's perfect soccer mom, received money from this man for the marriage, and he went on to sexually abuse and assault my client for over 4 years, keeping her isolated in a home where she also performed labor, an experience that she describes as like being kept in a jail cell. And even prior to marriage, my client had been the victim of ongoing sex trafficking as facilitated by her mother. And many times as a child, she did try and self-advocate. Her situation had been investigated by Child Protection. She had called the police and other systems, and time again, as Amanda mentioned, and as Finus' story illustrated, systems and communities failed to believe her and failed to protect her. And the forced marriage was just the culmination of that violence for her. And the laws in Maryland, and quite frankly, in many other states, there are 25 states that have quite lax laws on minimum age of marriage that allow for this kind of marriage to take place, because there are no built-in protections for minors being forced or coerced into marriage by the very people who are supposed to be protecting them from harm. And parental consent in the context of marriage is often concealing parental coercion. And this allows for much older adults to marry minors with really no meaningful oversight. And on top of that, once married, statutory rape cannot be charged in the state of Maryland and in many other states. But I don't want to leave with that sort of doom and gloom perspective. And what I want to share finally is that the good news is that this courageous woman and many other survivors like her are campaigning across the country to update marriage laws that turn a blind eye to this kind of forced marriage. And in cases like what I just described, are just another way that human trafficking can be facilitated and perpetuated, and to protect future generations from this kind of harm. And that includes an ongoing active legislative campaign in Maryland as we speak. And so that's the note that I want to leave you on, that even with the stories and statistics shared with you already, there are incredible advocates like Finus and like Amanda and like Martina, leading the way to solutions that will truly prevent harm and bring justice in all of its forms, whatever that looks like, to survivors. And there are lots of opportunities to support this work and get involved. So as the Reverend shared, please do take a look at the resources and the websites that will sort of be shared on screen at the end of our presentation today. And with that, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Casey. It's important for us to talk about the best we can about data, which Amanda has spoken to, and thank you for sharing the case study. And I know, Martina, you have some additional information and some studies to share as well.
I do. Thank you so much, Reverend Katie. And it's an honor to be on this panel with Amanda and Casey and Finus. I want to thank everyone and point back really to what Amanda said, because so much harm has been done to the anti-trafficking movement by QAnon. So we're thrilled that you're here to actually listen to facts from people who've worked in the movement for such a long time. So I want to give 4 cases to you, because I think it's really important to have illustrations about how this works and how trafficking manifests here in the United States. So much as Casey has done in the forced labor context, I want to talk about 4 cases that literally happened in Cedar Lane's backyard in Maryland and in this region. So one is actually the case of a person who's on our board of directors, an incredibly courageous woman named Evelyn Chumbo, who is from Cameroon. And Evelyn came to the United States. She was trafficked here as a child and was held as a child slave in a home in Maryland, paid nothing, physically harmed as a child, and also told that she had to do all of the domestic work and also take care of all of the children in the house, many of whom were no older than she. So she was the child who stayed home and worked. She never went to school. And much like Finus said, I was invisible, Evelyn Chumbo, who was actually on the White House Council advising the president on human trafficking issues under the Obama administration, one thing that Evelyn Chumbo said was she took the children to the bus stop and no one asked why she never got on the bus, even though she was the same age as the children she was delivering to the bus and then picking up at the end of the day. Miraculously, Evelyn's case was prosecuted and her trafficker, who was also from Cameroon, went to prison. But one thing happened in Evelyn's case that I think is important to note because we see it so frequently. There was restitution, so criminal compensation ordered, but it was not paid. So another case that happened literally in your backyards is a case US versus Shelby Lewis, a case that was actually prosecuted in the District of Columbia before Judge Sullivan. Shelby Lewis was a trafficker who would recruit teenage girls. He would say to them, he would find them in bus shelters and find children in foster care, as Amanda mentioned. And he would say to them, you can come and live with us and we will be your family. He was so clever that he even managed to go to court and get custody of one of these children. So he became the legal guardian. Once that happened, he put that child out for commercial sexual exploitation. The children in these cases, and in this particular case, in the Shelby Lewis case, there were 4 children. Each one of those children had a quota, the amount of money that she was required to earn every day doing commercial sex acts. And as Amanda mentioned, children can't consent to that. So any child who is in the commercial sex industry is automatically defined as trafficked. Shelby Lewis was arrested. His arrest was, I would say, serendipitous because the police in this case were about to arrest one of the children. That's one thing that we see in the human trafficking movement is victims arrested, victims prosecuted, victims convicted of crimes, and then completely unable to go on with their lives because they have this huge criminal record that follows them around like a ball and chain. In this particular case, the trafficker had left this child on the strip. The child was being interviewed by a detective and she mentioned the name Shelby Lewis. And the detective, who had been on this beat for a long time, recognized that name and realized that this wasn't the first child that Shelby Lewis had placed into this circumstance. Shelby Lewis is still in prison. Luckily, there was a pro bono attorney who was appointed by Judge Sullivan, and there was a restitution order for compensation in this case. Based on the restitution compensation order that the court ordered, the children were supposed to get $3.8 million in compensation for the harm to them. Those cases are unusual only because they were prosecuted. And I think Amanda would certainly agree with me that the majority of cases are never prosecuted, and particularly not forced labor cases. And Finus Lupenga's case is a perfect example of a case that was brought as a civil case for damages, but was never prosecuted by the authorities. I mentioned that some of these cases come to light simply because of serendipity. There was a case of a domestic worker who was in the United States working for a World Bank employee in Virginia. Neighbors called the Human Trafficking Hotline, which can be reached at 888-3737-888. Neighbors called the Human Trafficking Hotline in that case, and the report that they gave to the hotline was that there was a woman who only came outside to take out the garbage, and she looked sad. That was the report. As it turned out, that woman had been held in that house for 4 years and paid nothing, held in domestic servitude. The case was never prosecuted. Similarly, and this is the last case that I want to share, there was a US diplomat. Again, Finus talked about cases of diplomats trafficking domestic workers with special visas here in the United States. There is also trafficking, unfortunately, by US diplomats who are stationed abroad. So in an important civil case, Doe versus Howard, that was brought in the Eastern District of Virginia Federal Court, a young woman from Ethiopia brought a case against an American diplomat and her Australian retired diplomat husband for forced labor in Japan. The diplomat had trafficked the domestic worker to Japan. While the diplomat was at the US Embassy working, her husband was forcing the domestic worker to provide him sexual services. So that case was brought not just as a forced labor case for all of the domestic work, but also as an involuntary servitude case for all of the involuntary sexual labor that she was required to provide in that household. The verdict in that case was a $3 million judgment for the victim. Money can't make things right. And the shock of this case is that it wasn't prosecuted by the authorities. So I'll just wrap up with one number, which I think gives us a sense of how the methods that we've used, the approaches that we've used over the last 20 years since Amanda mentioned that definition was adopted under federal law, is not working. In 2019, according to the US government's own statistics, there were 220 prosecutions for all forms of trafficking in the entire country brought by federal authorities, 220. Of that, only 12 of those cases were for forced labor. In 2020, we just ran the data. The Human Trafficking Legal Center has a database of every criminal and civil case brought in the US federal courts. We just ran the data, and this is preliminary, and we haven't announced it publicly, so this is a first, but based on the numbers that we've run for 2020, there were 78 prosecutions at the federal level in the entire country for human trafficking, of which 6 were for forced labor. So if we think that we are going to prosecute our way out of human trafficking through a carceral approach, we are dead wrong. And there's a major rethink and a paradigm shift in the human trafficking movement at this point, thinking much more along the lines of prevention. So what is prevention in this context? Prevention is dealing with the underlying causes of human trafficking, dealing with homelessness, with poverty, with the inadequacy of the foster care system, dealing with the failure to allow freedom of association and workers' rights, the failure to deal with underlying problems such as wage theft. So we are looking at a major rethink after 20 years of work in this area. So I hope we can have some questions about that. I know Amanda and Casey and Finus, I'm sure, have things to say about this as well. So thank you so much for your attention to this issue, and thank you for inviting me to participate.
Thank you so much, Martina, Finus, Casey, and Amanda. And as we move into this space of question and answer, I invite those of you on Zoom to please write your questions in the chat. And if you're joining us on Facebook, please write your questions in the chat there as well. And I do want to let everyone know that this is being recorded. We are going to share this recording on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. Please do share this information with everyone that you know. It's important. I'd like to begin. Finus, you spoke first, and you shared your truth and the power of your voice with us. And I would like to ask the first question to you. Can you tell me how important pro bono attorneys may be to survivors?
Can you repeat your question, please?
Yes, absolutely. How important are pro bono attorneys to survivors?
Well, pro bono lawyers like Martina are very important to have, because that's the reason I won my case. I have a presentation. So having a pro bono lawyers like Martina is crucial. So that is why also it's good to donate to organizations like Martina.
But I have to say, I'm actually not Finus's lawyer. So,
Well,
so Finus had wonderful lawyers at American University, Washington College of Law. Can you talk about them as well, Finus, if you don't mind?
Yeah, so when I escaped, when I escaped, actually, the American Law School took my case, and they worked with me for a while, but then like I had it, it was time for me to move on after I had my strength. I did English more, and I had my strength. It was time for me to move on to open the civil case. So my personal lawyer from American University, Megan Haskins, reached out to Martina, whom I didn't know. I have no business with Martina, I promise. My personal lawyer, Megan Haskins, reached out to Martina, and Martina referred my case to the big law firm here in Washington, D.C., Jones Day. So Jones Day, yes, took my case, civil case, and they worked tirelessly and the long hours. And as I said, I won $1.1 million, although I don't have the money, but for me, justice is more than the money. I mean, like I am, what happened to me doesn't define me, first of all, and I am the leader. I'm going to places like speaking in court or for appeals. I made like, high people, like respected people, like I work side by side with them. So yeah, Martina is not my lawyer, but like she's a big source, because it's not only me, there's other survivors who also get their help, get their got their justice because of having like resources like Martina. Martina is a big resource because she does make referrals, like matching up like victim survivors to like pro bono lawyers who can help them, like myself. So
Thank you. Amanda, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about about some research about sex trafficking and what it might say. I know you touched on that when you were speaking earlier, but is there anything else that you might want to add?
Sure, absolutely. I think that even though from a worldwide perspective, we understand that more people are trafficked for forced labor than those who are trafficked for sexual purposes. We do know that of those who are trafficked for commercial sexual purposes, that the majority are women. And I believe the reason that we might have some more research now around sex trafficking is because this form of human trafficking had much of the attention and focus of agencies in the first decade after this federal law and international protocol were adopted back in 2000. So I think in many ways, states and communities are catching up with our understanding of labor trafficking compared to sex trafficking. But a few numbers or studies that I could reference. One, the Field Center back in 2018 had interviewed 270 homeless youth in Washington, D.C., Philly, and Phoenix between the ages of 17 and 25. And 1 in 5 individuals in that study were determined to have been victims of trafficking or to have had that experience, and that 25% had been approached for paid sex their first night of homelessness. Earlier, 2012, a study had been released around understanding the intersectionality of identity and human trafficking, and the ways in which those identities and vulnerabilities connect with exploitation. And 1 in 4 LGBTQIA+ youth had been subjected to sexual exploitation and sexual assault. When we look at our child welfare systems, for instance, and the reason I'm giving some examples of research around sex trafficking is because we are trying to understand those root causes that Martina talked about, right? We're trying to understand the impacts of homelessness, talking about our foster care system. In general, the studies that continue to come out from our child welfare systems across the country show that 50% to 90+% of the children they're serving have experienced some form of sex trafficking. And so those are pretty astounding numbers that really do demand our attention in terms of understanding how we are treating youth. The services that are set up to protect youth are failing. And so how do we do better? So those would be some of the, I guess, additional studies I might highlight. Maybe others have examples too.
Thank you so much, Amanda. A question came up in the chat. Why are the prosecution numbers so low? Is it the state of the law? And if so, how can the law be improved to better address these cases? So I think that's a threefer in terms of questions. And I'm wondering if perhaps you could field it, Martina, and if anyone has anything additional to add, please, from the panel, do chime in on this important.
So it's such a great question. And frankly, the law is great. We have a really good law, and our law allows for people to get T visas. You can get a T visa if you're a trafficking survivor to remain in the United States. That T visa can become a green card, and that green card can eventually become citizenship. The laws are not the problem. I worked at Human Rights Watch for a very long time and documented human rights abuses all around the world. And the conclusion that we came to in 99.9% of the cases was that the laws were fine and the implementation terrible. And unfortunately, what we have in the United States is an implementation problem. So the federal authorities are not bringing labor cases, and it's a really significant question why that's not happening. There's a new law review article by a professor at the University of Arkansas Law School on why there's so few labor trafficking prosecutions. And so I think all of us are asking these questions. I should add, this isn't just a US problem. This is a global problem. And even though, as Amanda says, probably 3/4 of the people around the globe are trafficked into forced labor in a kind of regular non-sex labor sector, there are only about 959 criminal cases for forced labor in the entire world. So the United States is not an outlier, which is why I think a lot of us are rethinking this and really thinking that we need to turn to prevention and workers' rights issues.
Thank you so much. And I would actually like to direct a question to all of you. What can be done in terms of prevention?
Finus, do you want to start? I think you have some good ideas about sort of what can be done to prevent this.
We have to deal, I mean, we have to deal with things that like what it causes, like what causes like people to be trafficked. For myself, I'm gonna give you the answers myself. Before I was trafficked to the United States growing up, you talk about child marriage. I was married before I turned my 18th birthday when I was probably 15. Before I turned my 18th birthday, I already give birth to 3 children, 1 lost and 2 children. So before I turned 18th, poverty, being poor first. None of my siblings, I came from like a broken home. My parents, my dad was alcoholic, smoking. My mom is a survivor of DV, and I dropped out of school and I met my boyfriend, and my boyfriend was abusive, physical. And like, just imagine at 17, give birth to 3 children. So how that, what kind of picture do you have in your head? So coming to America, having an opportunity to come to America, it was like an opportunity for me of like escaping, because not only that, I also involved, like I was raped back home so many times, some of them including family members, child molested. Here in America, when I was trafficked, labor trafficking, I was so raped. So those causes are crucial. So we have to look at these causes and like trying to solve one by step. That's how we're gonna end human trafficking.
Can I just jump in for 1 second? Because one of the things that Finus and I are colleagues, and so she has done advocacy with the State Department. And one of the things that she has advocated for successfully is getting the State Department to actually check in on domestic workers who are working for diplomats. And so there are now check-in meetings, and that's a really important prevention tool so that domestic workers are not abandoned and alone in the United States without any ability to reach out. The other thing that I would just add, and I'm going to hand the baton to Amanda or to Casey, we have a kind of small scale American kafala system, right? Kafala is when your visa is tied to your employer. And in Finus's case, and in the case of so many people trafficked by diplomats, the moment you leave your diplomat's house, the moment you leave your employer's house, the moment that you escape, as Finus did so courageously, you're out of status and you can be deported. So that chain of a visa being connected to an employer is really problematic.
And I can just sort of jump in and relate, the work that Tahirih is doing very much mirrors a lot of the ways in which we have talked about and touched on sort of compounding harms, making children in particular quite vulnerable to becoming victims and to being exploited. And when we talk to the survivors that come to Tahirih for support, whether it's because they are currently in a marriage that they were forced into and are being forced to remain, and that's not only by their perpetrator, but by all of the people in the community and family that surround them that tell them they are not allowed to leave, or if they're coming to us prior to seeking to prevent being forced into marriage in the first place. Those types of cases look very, very different, and how we respond looks very, very different. And the first example where the harm has already occurred, they didn't have the opportunity to get to us prior to, but they're looking to leave, is actually, in fact, often far more straightforward, because our systems are set up to respond to violence that has already happened. But when we're working with, let's say, a young woman who comes to us at the age of 16, and nothing, quote unquote, has happened yet, or nothing has been documented yet, or nothing that rises to the level of a Child Protective Services intervention or any other type of intervention by another system. And we're trying to get folks to help us prevent a known forced marriage in the future, which we know will be followed by forced consummation, which we know will often look like servile marriage after the fact. Our systems are just not set up to respond in those preventative ways. But because we know that so many of those survivors touch child protection, or perhaps the foster care system, or some other mental health care provider, many of our clients have been in and out of inpatient youth psychiatric wards, and never once does someone ask the right question to be able to let that person give the full scope of what they've been facing in their home. We have a lot of teens that run away over and over and over again, and children are seen as delinquent and parents are seen as benevolent, and the right questions are never asked. Why is that child running away? What is going on in that home? And when my clients have disclosed, they are often dismissed and not believed, because people think the idea of being trafficked or being forced into marriage by your own parents is so far-fetched that individual must truly be making it up. And so I think we have a lot of work to do in the child protection system, and only one state so far has actually taken the step to write forced marriage into its child protection statute, and that's the state of Texas. And they have a preventative protection order now that any protective adult, whether you are a child protection worker or just that child's best friend's mom, you can petition for that protection order to prevent a future forced marriage of that minor. And we have asked all states to take that step, to put this issue squarely within the mandate of Child Protective Services, because so often when those calls are made, they'll say that sounds like a cultural issue, or that sounds like a family matter, and that's not something we touch. And then we get into the system of frying pan to fire, where someone might, be forced into marriage by their parents, but also I have had clients say, my home life was so abusive and so tough that I saw marriage as the only way out of it, in hopes that that might at least be easier. And so either way, we need, I think, as Martina touched on and as Amanda touched on, if there's one place to focus a lot of our efforts, it is on that work to protect youth, to reform our systems, because they're not only failing trafficking survivors and forced marriage survivors, they're failing LGBTQIA youth, There's just a lot of work to be done in that space if we're talking about prevention.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat is there a screening tool that has been developed or is available for professionals to use? So I'm guessing this is for, those who are teachers, social workers, medical professionals, or other professionals who may encounter someone who is being trafficked.
So the answer is yes, and Amanda and Casey may have other suggestions. The resource that I would point people to is Heal Trafficking, which is actually an association of physicians. It's run by a wonderful doctor, Dr. Hannes Stoklasa, who's from a professor at Harvard. And they have a listserv. And on that listserv, there are multiple articles and things that they share. And one of the things that they share are screening tools. But Amanda, you may know of others as well.
Yeah, I think it would, I would second that recommendation. Thanks, Casey, too. I also think it depends on the screening tool for which professional or group that we're talking about. So the Vera Institute has a tool that a lot of organizations across the country are looking at. And it totally depends on your profession, but I think Heal Trafficking, HEAL, is a great place to start.
Yeah, and just briefly, specifically around forced and child marriage, Tahirih has developed several tip sheets for different professionals, as you say, Amanda and Martina. It will vary how you ask questions and what is your interaction with the youth and the individuals you come into contact with. And so there's one for teachers, one for hotline advocates, one for refugee service providers, and there's one for medical providers, and particularly focused on forced and child marriage and how to spot signs and screen carefully and thoughtfully. And that's at the link that I put in the chat.
And I would put emphasis on Casey's words, carefully and thoughtfully, right? Because unfortunately, much of the rhetoric about human trafficking is about rescue. And rescue is absolutely the wrong approach. And if you look at Finess's story, Finess rescued herself, right? Finess escaped herself. So I would just be very careful about falling into the rhetoric of rescue. And so I completely agree with Casey about doing the screening carefully and with great caution.
Thank you so much. And that actually brings me to another question for you, Finess. What support did you need after you escaped?
I need everything. First of all, I needed like a place to feel safe, to be safe, which is housing. I left everything behind when I ran away. So I need everything, but mostly I need housing. But also not only that, the other thing I needed mental. I was suffering PSD, depression, that never been treated. And as I said, there was no medical. My teeth, I lost my teeth. I needed mental, I needed health care. So dental is crucial. I suffered to navigate, health care, like even after I left. So I need everything, but mainly housing, mental, and dental, those three, and the rest 4.
Thank you, Finess. And I want to honor all of your time. We are just at almost 4 o'clock, and I'm wondering if each of the panelists, maybe beginning with Finess and then Amanda, and then Casey, then Martina, if as we're closing out our time together tonight, and before we show the slides that have all of the organization's contact info, I'm wondering if each of you could reflect with us for a moment on what you see on the horizon that is bringing hope in your work. So if you would like to start us off, Finess, with what's on the horizon that is bringing you hope in your work.
what brings me hope is when I see people like taking action. And when I see people, when I see people getting rescued, that gives me hope. And when I see the community get involved, taking action, like that gives me life, give me hope.
I think what brings me hope is in this very strange time during the pandemic, there have been so many new innovative ways that people have been able to connect with services, mental health services through the use of technology, telehealth, telemental health services that has been so critical. And so I think our ability to create greater accessibility has really just shifted in many ways. I also think that it's been such an amazing time to connect with youth, with our own kids, and talk about what trust means, what that means in an online virtual space, what that means with people. And so I'm really hopeful that we're able to focus on a lot of those lessons learned and carry that forward as individuals, but as collective communities too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, it's been seeing how intentional the movement is starting to become around centering survivors like Finus in the work that we're doing to write new laws, to create new programming, whatever the case may be. It's been about, I'll speak directly to our campaign on ending child marriage in the US. It's been really beautiful since 2016 to now to see how many survivors are now at the center of those campaigns and have founded their own organizations and are working directly with legislators to make change happen. And in almost every space we find ourselves in now, there is an intentionality around centering survivors in these conversations that we just didn't see maybe 5 years ago, probably even more recently. And so I'm just deeply grateful for that and inspired and in awe of people like Finus all the time. So thank you.
Thank you, Casey. Finus.
Yeah, I just want to say one important thing. Another thing that bring me hope is to see survivors lead. When I see the community let survivors lead, that gives me hope, because survivors were the center of the anti-trafficking movement. Nothing about us without us.
I think Finus and Casey just knocked it out of the park, and I have nothing to add. So I think we should leave it right there. I completely agree.
Thank you all so much for the work that you do and for being here this evening. We are going to conclude our program tonight with some slides from each of the organizations that you work with and your contact information. I'm also going to ask our